Hello everybody and welcome. Today I would like to talk about something that I just really realized I kind of have had for years a pretty deep passion about in terms of wanting to talk about and think about, and that is the logistics behind things that people consider to be renewable and environmentally friendly and sustainable. And one of those things currently that finally after years and years is finally people are starting to recognize, hey, you know what, this isn't renewable, it doesn't make sense, and in the long term and in the long run it's actually a net negative. It has an impact on the environment in the long run, and that is electric cars. More and more people are finally realizing that battery electric vehicles, especially battery electric cars, are actually in the long run going to be a net negative impact on the environment of the world, not just, of course, to the locality of which they get disposed of once they're dead. And I'm not just talking about the batteries. The entire vehicle is a net negative from its beginning point, because you still have to blow apart mountains and other landscapes of the earth just to fucking mine the resources to build the chassis, to build the body, to build, you know, all these stupid things. And then all you think about the impact of the factories that those have, especially with all the automation, all the tech. It requires, I guarantee you, way more energy than it would by hand labor, old school. So like, there's a lot of things to consider rather than just simply looking at the surface value and thinking, well, obviously this is efficient, it makes total sense, like people have done throughout history. Clearly, that is complete bullshit. It doesn't work like that. Nothing ever in life works that simply. You have to fully consider the reality and the long term and all the finite details down to the nitty gritty. It might seem boring, it might seem intensive, it might seem annoying to have to spend the time to do that, but it's the only way we really learn things and really are able to future-proof and understand the real likelihoods and potentialities of what the outcome in the long run is going to be from whatever it is that we're doing that we think at surface value, as in right now, and in the short term, it's going to have a benefit. Electric vehicles are a perfect example of that. Fortunately, people are finally starting to realize, yeah, actually this is not making sense. They don't fully realize the full overall long-term negative impact that they have, but at the very least, they're finally waking up to it, a lot of the world, and a lot of these environmentalists that used to be all gung-ho for them, which is a good thing and a great sign. But that's not actually what I wanted to specifically speak about today. I actually want to speak about nuclear energy, nuclear power plants. Because currently, especially all these big environmentalists, right, environmental supporters and everything, are like, it's one of the most renewable, natural, well, not natural, but, you know, renewable, sustainable, environmentally friendly, so to speak, form of energy production. That is complete bullshit, because the fact, if you look at it like that, then yeah, you're looking at like everybody look at electric cars, or have been looking at electric cars, right? They're like, oh, well, on the surface and for the short term, it makes perfect sense. It's this way. Maybe in the short term, but in the long term, there's no logic to support anything nuclear. And I mean anything. Because it is, in the long term, it is incredibly negative. It has a huge negative footprint and impact on all life. Not just the Earth itself and the environment, therefore. It has a hugely negative impact on the entire world, whether it's the animals, so the flora and the fauna, or, you know, us, human beings. It has a long-term, massively negative impact, footprint, that it actually has in the long run. The simplest basis to clearly see already one of the reasons why nuclear power is actually incredibly negative on the entire world and the entire environment, especially now more than ever, with all the droughts and everything, is the intensely high, intensely high, continuous, perpetual requirement of water intake. You require, even fission, not just fusion, you literally require a obscene amount of water to produce and to cool the production centers, the nuclear power plants, to cool the reactors, and to literally produce and also output the byproduct of that production into. And the byproduct is waste, that is nuclear waste. And you can't just say, well, okay, but, I mean, yeah, we have a lot of droughts, but we need energy production, so, obviously it's still a necessary evil. Wrong. See, that's still surface value thinking. It's typical for a human being to only think of what you feel you need and require to live your life now. Technically, and this is true, although this goes a little correlative branch off a bit into its own rabbit hole, but technically, nobody needs electricity for anything. Like, you could go full old school tribal, nomad. You can still live a full life very easily if you learned the necessary survival skills and learned ingenuity and do-it-yourself type of tactics. Of course, you have the redundancy of the fact that I'm sitting here using technology to record the video to give this perspective to you all, but you still don't need any of this. Nobody does. It can have its uses, obviously, but it's not 100. The point is, it's not 100% necessary. So, like, saying that it's a necessary evil to say, well, this has an excuse to use an obscene amount of water into perpetuity. To me, there's no logic in that argument. It kind of argues itself out of existence because it just doesn't quite work or make any sense to me, at least, and I'm sure to other people too. Because then it seems like it's a counterreactive argument, I guess is what it would be. It just doesn't really quite add up to me. But yeah. Anyway, so if you want to be technical and picky, nobody needs electricity. We all could live back probably how it should be, kind of back in a commune like, so a communal or like a tribal type of living where everybody barters to get the things that they need and to give the things that somebody else needs, and in bartering, that's how bartering works. That would be the economy, and then of course, but that's a different topic for a different day. But point being, nobody technically needs electricity. That said, with our advent of electricity and all of that, yes, so nuclear power obviously is one of the more popular ones. In fact, it's getting more and more popular because, again, more and more people that claim to be environmentalists or environmental experts or whatever else say it's one of the most sustainable and renewable forms of electricity. But it's really, in the long term, it's not, because of the obscene amount of water it requires into perpetuity to function at all and to produce any electricity and to keep them cool. But yeah, there's a part two. There is a bunch of cases, especially here in the United States, where basically there is nowhere to store any of the nuclear waste that they've been producing even since they've been making nuclear bombs back in the 50s and 60s and 40s with their experiments like the Manhattan Project and all of that. They have nowhere to put any of their nuclear waste from any nuclear production types. Nowhere. And so they know that the best place and the most safe thing to do for everyone and everything in the environment is to bury it deep underground in very thick, reinforced layers of concrete or cement. Basically in bunkers. Here's the problem here, is that, at least in the United States, nobody wants to know that they're the ones in their state, in their home, that are harboring, even if it's 1,200 feet underground, a large bulk load of the nuclear waste that this country produces. Nobody. Not even in hundreds of miles. And at that deep. Nobody wants that. And the proof of that is in the Yucca Mountain Project, which, in a video by Top Luxury, and I'm sure videos by other people, it's officially dubbed as one of the most useless mega projects in the world, because of the fact that this thing has been in proposal and planning since basically the 1960s. It didn't really get properly suggested until the late 70s, and then it ends up finally getting funding to be built, and they've just choose that location in the late 80s and early 90s. And then they've been building it up until about 2010 or so. Then Obama stopped it because it got so politicized and nobody wanted it, and all the residents and even the state legislature, I believe, of Nevada wanted nothing to do with it, and so they were aggressively fighting against it and saying, do not let this happen. We don't want this in our state. And then I believe it was federal courts that the federal court actually said you have to continue this project, and so they started it back up again in 2013, and yet it has basically gotten zero funding, and nothing's happened with the construction since. So it's basically still halfway through construction, just kind of sitting there going derelict. Because basically it seems like nobody is willing to accept that or want it there. But here's another aspect of how dumb that it requires, how dumb of people and dumb-mindedness that this kind of stuff requires. Because the fact that the people want nothing to do with nuclear waste anywhere near their homes, right? Anywhere near where anybody lives. It's just understandable, right? Of course. The problem with this is the fact that right now, it could literally be in your own backyard, but basically within just a few miles, 10, 20 miles of your suburban home in the US, you will find a nuclear waste storing site because they have nowhere to put it. And it's surface in these barrels that are rusting away on these sites. A great case of that is anywhere around the Hanford Reach area and that bend of the Columbia River. So anywhere from there in that vicinity, all the way down through the Tri-Cities, even over towards Walla Walla, down through Umatilla and Pendleton and Hermiston and all of that area. They have a bunch of places where quite literally they're just storing massive quantities of nuclear waste right there. And it's pretty much just outside of people's own backyards. In fact, one of those places they're storing it is in Pendleton. Pendleton has about 25,000 people, and closer by is Hermiston, which is growing at a stupidly rapid rate. Like, you have a good amount of people around that vicinity. Basically around a half of a grand, 100,000 people or so in that vicinity. You might not think that's much, but that's a lot of people that are pretty much in their backyard. There's a massive storage facility on top of the ground. And also in bunkers that don't actually go very deep in that same property. And it's just next door to the fucking airport of Pendleton, which still sees commercial use. It's still, admittedly, for the size of the population of the area, pretty heavily used, including by commercial flights. So it's like, this stuff is right outside of your back door, it's in your backyard, or it's within a walk or a run of your place, or even a short drive of like 10, 20 miles outside of your own backyard or front door is where nuclear waste is being stored. And it doesn't count the nuclear waste that's still being produced and thus technically in storage temporarily on the nuclear power plant sites, which there is a fair amount of them here in the United States, which are also right next to metropolitan areas. And so the logic against, say, Yucca Mountain in Nevada, which is literally selected because it's one of the lower population states in the nation, and specifically that location is pretty equidistant from two different population bases, the main two different population bases of Nevada. The obviously Las Vegas, Henderson, Nevada metro area, and then of course you have the Carson City up through Reno and Sparks. It's pretty much equidistant between those two. East and west, there's virtually nobody for a lot further distance, I believe. So, geographically, it's placed in a perfectly logical place. It's also right next to where they were testing some of those nuclear weapons back in the day, and that it's therefore right next to a currently owned and utilized military site. It makes perfect sense to store it there, right? Especially, again, 900, 1,200 feet below ground, 300 meters below this mountain in the middle of nowhere. At least it's guaranteed to be within 90 to, or as far as 90 to 100 or more miles from your house. At closest, 90 to 100. From the closest living resident, it's guaranteed that. So why is it that everybody's so against that? And yet, it's because it's supposedly they don't want it in their backyard and they don't want to know they're storing it. Well, you're back to square one again. Now you still have it sitting there and you're literally in your backyard endlessly closer to your house, and we're pretending like that's fine. And you've made such a great victory when clearly this is false. Because there's no logic behind that belief. Because you're defeating your own purpose of trying to get it as far away from people and yourself as possible. You immediately defeated that successfully by fighting against Yucca Mountain. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be able to store all of this nation's nuclear waste. Not even close. I think they figured at max it might be able to store about 60% of it, but I doubt it would even held that much. Maybe 50% if you're generous, but there's a lot more nuclear waste, I'm sure, than they're ever willing to publicly state and admit to this population of this country. Nevertheless, that's another major issue with it, is where the hell do you store the waste? There's nowhere really to store it, and also that still is going to have, naturally, especially in the long run, a negative impact on the environment in the long run, because of the fact that you have nuclear waste literally buried inside of the earth, and eventually, I would assume it's guaranteed that, say, 100 or more years later, no matter how much you reinforce that thick-ass layers of concrete underneath the mountain, it's eventually going to form some leaks, and eventually what's left is going to seep through that. It might be minimized, in fact it would be minimized compared to it just sitting in there in the barrel and letting that leak, because you literally have had it there for 60, 100 years, and you haven't done anything with it because, well, where do you put it? Like, this is the best we got, and they know that. There's nothing else you can do, because you cannot recycle or get rid of, at least not fully, radioactive waste. You just can't. Nuclear waste. So how do you deal with it? Well, this is the best way you can at least get away from it. You can't do anything with it, but you certainly can get away from it, at least to an extent, especially how quickly urbanizing the world's population is, and this is the best case scenario. So, effectively, that's the third major reason why in the long term, there's a major issue with nuclear power. And why it makes absolutely no sense. Now, going back to the first point, one of the obvious and very necessary and major reasons why it makes impeccable sense to ensure that you're being smart and you make sure nuclear power plants have plenty of water perpetually is because of the fact that if you don't give it enough water, it overheats. And if it overheats, it goes into what's called a nuclear meltdown. And nuclear meltdowns are what we call Chernobyl. You're literally going to have a Chernobyl on your hands. It might not be as catastrophic, but it's certainly going to be terrible, especially for within at least a 100-mile radius on average, I would think, is going to be obviously the worst impacted for our much smaller than Chernobyl-sized nuclear plants. You're still, if they go into meltdown because they don't get enough water, and they don't get their perpetual water, then you have catastrophe. The fact that people try to defend that as still being renewable, still being sustainable, and still being environmentally friendly, when they know how lethally, intensely deadly, and how endlessly long it takes before it's considered safe, with guidance and gear, to enter a zone that's experienced a meltdown, or experienced some kind of radioactive leak that was enough for long enough that it's had a massive impact on the environment and thus the people and things living within the vicinity. Like, the fact that people still defend it as this wonderful thing, it makes no sense. Absolutely zero. Let alone the fact that they consider it environmentally friendly. Clearly it's not. Even if you do everything right, things can still go wrong. I mean, that's just called life in general, right? Well, there's a lot more things that can go wrong with a nuclear power plant. Now, you might go like, well, let's look at the statistics to say, fuck you. You could do that. And you might find that it's overall rarer than I seem to be expressing it to be. You might find it's actually more common than you think it is, at least in these small little issues where they are small in the sense of comparative to, say, again, a grand scale event like a Chernobyl. These are very small events that fucked over a population or an area for a while. Ultimately, I think a great example that people can look to in the world for why nuclear is just not a smart idea is the fact that you have to look at Hanford Reach. You have to look at the Hanford power plant. Because the government has been perpetually, and still is, constantly aggressively suppressing and manipulating reports to make it look like they're in the clear and it's fine, and it's not. It hasn't been leaking, at least not that bad, for a long time, and therefore all these health issues and cancer that keeps happening to a lot of surprisingly large portions of the population down the river flow from Hanford, it couldn't possibly be tied. But you look at anybody else who's lived through there, and those independent groups who've lived through there who have researched it, gotten teams together, and actually gotten the data on it, they have proven, since even the 80s, that it is absolutely putting nuclear waste and pollution, and enough of it, into the Columbia River that the people downwind, or even here and down to Oregon, oftentimes have had a intensively higher risk of cancer. And they have ended up having a much higher cancer rate as well. It didn't matter the age group. Especially if you associated anywhere within the Hanford Reach vicinity and the power plant vicinity, let alone you ended up spending a little too much time in the water around that vicinity and even through the Tri-Cities, you actually very likely would see, and you in fact I guarantee you would see, and they did confirm this a couple of times before, that you would literally see a intensely high spike. And almost a near guarantee that those people would end up with cancer very soon afterward. At some point in their lives. Basically within like 2 to 10 years, they'd end up with a cancer. And usually it was pretty bad. Let alone other health ailments that a lot of times keeps happening as a result of it too, or even perpetual sickness, like sickness to your stomach, so basically perpetual nausea, dizziness, things like that. And they've found, they know it's a correlative directly to what it's done to the Columbia River's water supply and its tributaries in the vicinity of Hanford Reach, how it's polluted it, and same with the ground pollution. It's a very good example to look at. They've found it's been leaking pretty much since its inception, when it first started. But it's especially been bad since about 1979, I believe. 78 or 79. It's really gotten bad since then. And, just the fact that it's causing such a high amount of cancer in the people who live within the vicinity, I think personally clearly proves the point that that's another great example to look at and think, okay, yeah. And then if it's happened to that, then there's guaranteeing it's happened probably a lot of other places, including places that nobody's even thought about it being a cause of an increase in cancer rates or anything like that. But the fact that it has that kind of an impact, just even a minor amount of exposure perpetually can do that to somebody. Any age, no matter how their health and how well they take care of themselves. Again, I think that very clearly proves a point that it's not a sustainable and not an environmentally friendly or safe form of energy. So ultimately, to me, this is the case against nuclear power. Like, it's not a renewable, like the case for the fact that it's clearly and provably not renewable. It's provably not sustainable, and it's certainly provably, and this is the most important one, it's improvably very negative in the long run against the environment and the health of anybody who lives within their vicinities. It takes up so much fucking water too. Like, you just think about the amount of drought that we're having, and it's getting worse and worse and worse with climatic change or whatever the heck's really happening. It's whatever you believe it to be, basically. It's getting so much worse every year, especially in the western half of the North American continent. I mean, records are being set pretty much every year, whether it's for wildfires or heat records or sustained days above 100 or whatever else, and a lot of places that shouldn't be having records like that broken. A lot of places getting endlessly drier, where they have record low rain totals for a year and things like that. It's just perpetual. And you throw this on top of that. You throw in the nuclear power plants and the fact that people are pushing harder for it, including in these states. They're not thinking it through. I think it's also kind of akin to, and this is a great comparison, I think, is the Southwest. The desert Southwest of the U.S. You have a look at like California, especially Southern California, let alone the entirety of California. Say anywhere from south of the Oregon border, basically, and Idaho border. So just go south of there. So specifically though, and especially Nevada, California, Arizona. The not only amount of wildfires they're having, the constant record-breaking they have pretty much every year now. But on top of that, their record low rain totals, their record low snow totals, the record low drought or record high droughts, their record high heats, and all this other stuff. They're losing water insanely fast, and they are like this year. There's a bunch of places, a bunch of lakes and reservoirs that they've used for water supply for a long time, including rivers, that set record low marks. That literally in their recorded history they had never gotten that low. And of course, they got a lot of people like, oh god. And politicians are going to be politicians. They're gonna go to whoever bought them into office. So of course, they're like, oh well, we're gonna overlook the fact that we have, especially in California, about 60,000 resorts, massive resorts, a whole slew of theme parks. Oh, right, a whole bunch of casinos. How about all of our endlessly massive, oversized, useless, exclusive golf courses? All the things that require the most water out of anything that involves people directly. Using and living in, operating, whatever. Though it's akin to that, because of the fact that you're intentionally choosing to overlook that these are the obvious big water intake places, and they don't have zero restrictions. Through even 2021, they've had zero restrictions on their water intake and their water use. Water use policy has been manipulated against the agricultural sector, so the farmers, the people, who what is that? Right, produce our fucking food, and then of course the against the average person too. They're like, fuck you, all of you. But if you're a resort, a theme park, some other kind of a massive fucking park that takes a lot of people, SeaWorld, you have, you happen to be a resort, a lodge, a casino, golf course. We'll let you have all the water you want. We're just going to pretend like you don't exist. But the average person and the people who produce our fucking food, they're the ones who need to cut down on their water supply and their water uses, clearly. Of course, this is going to a different topic again. But ultimately, that's where this whole shit comes from. Besides the fact that the people of this country are innately stupid, and they, again, only like to look at the surface value right now. And they don't think any further, and they don't look any further, because it's convenient not to spend a lot of time and brain power looking into issues, because it's innately boring to most people, especially logistics like that, and details, information, lots of wordy words. Just not conducive to my convenience and my comfort. So I'm just going to ignore that and spend all my time watching YouTube or Twitch or Netflix, any other streaming service, going out and wondering why I have a bad budget when I own a fucking Mercedes to make myself look like I'm rich when I'm not, and live in a shitty apartment. But at the same time, wonder why when I spend like every day at least $8 to $25 on coffee and another $8 to $25 on energy drinks every damn day, and I'm like, I wonder I can't seem to get more rich. Yes, I can't figure it out. I'm really good at budgeting. Oh, clearly. You probably also have the newest fucking phone too, don't you? Mm-hmm. Again, different story, but point remains. Anyway, so I think it's very applicable to be able to compare those two together. But yeah, that said, thank you for watching. Thank you for spending time with me to maybe learn something new today, or learn a new perspective, whatever it is, gain some value. With that said, I have been me, you have been you. At least I think, but I haven't checked if I'm me recently. Oh god! Anyway, and I'll see you from Existential Crisis in the next video. Stay safe out there. Thank you for watching. I'll see you around.